Well, she's a writer, historian, a journalist who grew up in the United Kingdom but went to university to study history and met Benazir Bhutto. And having met Benazir Bhutto, I went to live in Pakistan in 1978-79. And then I came back to work at the BBC, and I realized that I could never be a South Asia expert, as they say, if I didn't go to India. And almost on my way to India, I met someone from Kashmir. And so I was intending to do some interviews in Delhi, but then I first also came to Kashmir, and I came here for the first time, this very place where we're sitting now, in 1981. And that's how it began. That's how my love of Kashmir began. And having seen the valley, having seen the beauty, I became interested in the people, and as a historian, I became interested in the politics. It was very peaceful. It was very beautiful. That was what struck me, its beauty. But there was also this feeling, even then, that there was this sort of overriding, unresolved situation. And at that time, we couldn't tell, and I didn't have the knowledge I have now, that it would flare up and become what it has now become. But there was this certain feeling of uncertainty as to where political allegiance lay. And I think that's the sort of the most I can say at that moment in time, because I was much younger than I am now, and I didn't have the knowledge, I didn't have the understanding, I didn't have the historical awareness that I now have, having studied the issue in great depth. I didn't meet Sheikh Abdullah. No, I didn't. I never met. He was still alive at that time, but I didn't meet him. But I've met Farouk, and I've met Omar. I've met the Abdullahs, and I've met many of the political leaders during that period. I think it was the later politics that took place. I've been going to Pakistan, and by that time Benazir Bhutto had become Prime Minister. And of course, as you know, the insurgency really began in 1989, and it was because of that period, having had the visual image of Kashmir, I thought, well, that's what I'll write about. I'll write about Jammu and Kashmir, because it seemed to be a very unwritten subject. I would pick up a book in Pakistan, written by a Pakistani, and then I'd pick up a book in India, written by an Indian, as though it was a piece of real estate. But there wasn't the understanding that this was a piece of territory in which people lived, and they were the inhabitants of the state. I didn't find myself any literature, especially written by a foreigner, which brought up the voice of the Kashmiris. And if you look at that first book, which was called Kashmir In The Crossfire, I make a big point about saying, I've tried to talk to Kashmiris to find their stories, their truth. You can tell me your truth, now what is your truth? And I've tried to sort of bring them together in the book. So during that research phase, I did travel widely. I traveled in what the Pakistanis call AJK, Azad Jammu and Kashmir, what the Indians call POK. I traveled in Gilgit-Baltistan, and then I came over to this side, and I traveled in the Valley of Kashmir. I went to Ladakh. I've since been to Kargil, and I also went to Jammu, the Jammu region, to try and understand the complexities of this state, which the British put together as a creation in 1846. Well, it's obviously very important. It's one of the most, they always talk about it. Pakistan will say it's the core issue. And if you think back to 1947, had there not been a Kashmir issue, so to speak, think what different countries both Pakistan and India would have been. It's highly unlikely there would have been these nationalistic borders that mean that you can only cross at one point at Wagah. There would have been a greater coexistence if they hadn't had something to fight about. And they have been consistently fighting, whether it's physically at war or on paper, about the status of Jammu and Kashmir. I think the problem with the issue, as far as I've discovered, is that nobody can quite see where the end is. And you can get very concerned about an issue and you can promote an issue and work on it. But if you don't know where you're leading, people turn their attention to something else. And I think that's been one of the problems. Yes, it will suddenly flash into the headlines if there's a terrorist attack or if there's a likelihood of war or anything like that. But once you're actually looking at resolution, it's complicated, and you have to have this in-depth knowledge to understand it. It's not a quick fix situation. Added to that, as you well know, there were attempts at talks in 1962-63 brokered by the UK and the USA. But since 1972 and the Shimla Agreement, the government of India has had as a central tenet of its Kashmir policy that it's a bilateral issue only to be discussed with Pakistan. So you can't break the deadlock or have an injection of different oxygen into an issue that's really stuck. It's stuck in the old rhetoric. You can't have India will not permit a mediator, will not permit a facilitator. Whereas, we in Britain, we had a long-standing problem with Northern Ireland, but we realized that we had a long-standing problem and we brought in the United States. And you might think, well, that was extraordinary because Britain's a very proud country. But it broke the deadlock. It changed the dynamic. But when you've got the difficulty, and this is what governments do face, the difficulty of a government that doesn't want any help, those countries then turn their attention and say, okay, fine, well, you don't want help, therefore we can't help, because you can't force yourself in. You have to be invited in to be a facilitator or a mediator. And this has been one of the big difficulties in terms of talking about the pessimism. The Kashmir issue is not as important. It is important. It's very important. But it's difficult to know what the next step is going to be. Well, I think I've seen a marked difference in terms of the governments, because particularly even during the insurgency in the 90s, you had the feeling that these Kashmiris were disaffected, they were separatists, they were asking for something, they were misguided youth, they could be brought back into the fold. Whereas now, with this latest rhetoric, it's very much that Kashmiris are the other, and they've been sort of pushed back. And I think one of the watersheds was in the post-Pulwama period, when Kashmiris were attacked and told to go home. You don't do that to people you feel are your citizens. And so that was a marked difference. In addition, the use of pellet guns, which are supposedly meant to be the most humane, non-lethal weapon, because tear gas and water guns haven't worked. But it is not a non-lethal weapon when it blinds over 1,000 people. And so that I find very peculiar that hasn't been immediately curtailed, the use of pellet guns. So there is a change, and in terms of attitude and approach, I don't see that it's been for the better. And as far as I know, Kashmiris have jealously guarded the Article 370 and indeed the Article 35A, which enshrines the hereditary state order regarding permanent residence. And so I would say that this is not going to be a move that the average Kashmiri is going to welcome. But of course it will, because it will be a step in the direction which the Indian government may think it wants in terms of integration, but it will, I would say, undoubtedly fly in the face of what the average Kashmiri wants and thinks that they accepted when the state became part of India in 1947 with its special status. Well, that's the issue over Pakistan and India, you see, because you're talking about the Article 370 in relation to what will impact the Valley of Kashmir, Jammu and Ladakh. But let's not forget that 1/3 of the state is occupied, as the Indians would say, by Pakistan. So they still have to sit down at the negotiating table and talk to Pakistan about the status of Gilgit-Baltistan and AJK, POK. Well, I would like to think this is temporary, because I would like to think that one could get back what was already achieved. I think it was an advance that you had the border opening in 2005, and this cross-border trade benefited the inhabitants of the state. And so I would like to think, when everything settles down, that one could revert to cross-border trade. Kashmir in the Crossfire became Kashmir in Conflict in 2000.
Yes.
And there were 2 more editions in 2003 and 2010. So I think it's about time there was another edition of Kashmir in Conflict,
With
covering the last
obviously,
decade.
yes.
Well, that's something that I think is a very positive development. And I will say that also, I think since I started writing, many people in the world are much more conscious about the Kashmiris and the inhabitants of the state. They're not regarding it, as I said before, as a piece of real estate. But I'm thrilled that many, many Kashmiris, and starting with Basharat Kia and his Curfewed Night, but other books since then, poetry, novels, factual books, are being written by Kashmiris. And I'm constantly contacted by young Kashmiris who are studying in the UK, working on a PhD on some aspect of Kashmir. And I think that's very positive, because I think it's also up to Kashmiris to know their own history. Many people are doing theses on Jammu and Kashmir. Many people. As I say, I'm constantly contacted by young students in the UK and also in America who are doing PhDs, studies on aspects of Jammu and Kashmir.